Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. And we're going to go ahead and get started. I am so excited to talk to you about the 9 attitudes of mindfulness because unless people take mindfulness-based stress reduction or have some more in-depth training about mindfulness, the 9 attitudes don't really come into play as much unless there's like a very unique intention to bring those in. But when you look at the 9 attitudes, and we're going to go through each one rather quickly for the seriousness and the importance of everyone. However, I think that the goal tonight is really to give you a taste of what each of the attitudes are, and you'll see how universal these concepts really are. And so I'm sure that all of you have probably in some way, shape, or form had some contact with these 9 attitudes, whether it be reading about them, applying them in your own lives, maybe even noticing it in the practice of medicine or in healthcare in various ways. So the 9 attitudes were originally described by Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the creator of the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, in his seminal book, Full Catastrophe Living. And he has a wonderful YouTube video on the 9 attitudes. It's about 26 minutes long or so. And the funny thing is he only wrote about 7 attitudes in the book. And in his video, he says, oh, well, at the next edition, I'm going to add these last 2 attitudes. And so that's where the generosity and gratitude came. So it was like 7, and then there were 9. And I think the list could honestly go on. But I think why Jon kept it at 9, he specifically explains this in his video in that it's actually more difficult to remember things beyond 9. In fact, like 9 is kind of getting up there in terms of like a list that you're expected to remember. And without further ado, let's go ahead and do our settling practice. For mindful healthcare and healing collective events, we always like to start off with a mindfulness practice and end with a mindfulness practice. But today we will have a longer practice also in the middle, led by my co-teacher, Dr. Liang and Cooke. So I look forward to that. So I have my meditation bells here, and the meditation bells, there's nothing mystical or magical about them. They're simply a nice sound for you to focus your attention on initially, and they mark the beginning and the end of practice. So closing eyes, if you think that that would serve, or lowering your gaze a few inches in front of you, giving yourself permission to fully arrive for this next hour together in community. Inviting you to first notice the points of contact between you and the chair, or you and the ground. Settling in. And as you're ready, I'm going to invite you to notice your breath at your nostrils. Not trying to change the breath, but simply noticing that you're breathing. Noticing that there's a sensation when you breathe through the nostrils. Simply focusing on the felt sensation of breathing at the nostrils. And if any thoughts, other body sensations or emotions capture your attention, notice that and gently bring your attention back to your breath at the nostrils. And as you're ready, I invite you to check in with the rest of your body. For some of us, we've worked some long clinic days, or we're at work and there might have been some stress that has accumulated in your body. Just checking in and noticing if there's any areas of tension, discomfort, even pain. Acknowledging the felt sensation of that. Perhaps choosing to bring your breath to that area. Figuratively, but also literally. And seeing if there's a letting go or a softening of any tension. Simply because you paid attention to it and you invited the breath. And then next, coming back to the breath. Taking a moment now to notice how you feel compared to just a few minutes ago. Blinking open eyes and letting the light back in. So delving right in to the 9 attitudes of mindfulness. The first attitude is beginner's mind. So beginner's mind is the concept that regardless of what you're experiencing, that you're seeing it anew, like fresh for the first time. And this can be applied to anything that you encounter in life, really. Something as mundane as washing the dishes or folding clothes. What if you took a perspective that you were doing this for the very first time? Could you be curious about it and really notice all the different sensations and all the different components of driving this very intricate, coordinated action that many of us sometimes might forget our destination or miss our exit because we were so caught up in our thoughts or distracted for another reason. So, beginner's mind is seeing things anew as if for the very first time. And I wanted to open up to see if there were any examples of this, particularly in medicine, that anyone wanted to share. And if not, like, I'm happy to share an example, or Ellen can share an example. But if you want to unmute yourself and give us an example of what you think might be beginner's mind in your own life, in your own practice of medicine.
We have some quiet folks.
Do you have an example, Ellen, or I can share one too?
Well, it's not really in the practice of medicine, but I remember when I first started practicing mindfulness, I wanted to pick like an activity to practice beginner's mind with. That's something that just comes up frequently in life, and like each time I'm doing that, I have that mindset. And so I chose driving to work because normally I'm doing that at the time that the sun is coming up. And I realized, oh my gosh, all these years I've been driving this route to work in this like rote, like automatron mode. And I decided to use that as a time to really pay attention to what the sky looks like as I'm driving. And it was very refreshing to do that and realize like how many sunrises I probably missed before really paying attention.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a beautiful example of beginner's mind. Beginner's mind when applied to your commute to work. Something as simple as that, but something that can be so rich and beautiful simply because you broached it with a freshness and newness. even though you had driven the same route hundreds of times before.
Yeah, and interesting to see how each day is so different, you know. Yet the sky never looks quite the same. So
And yet it is still the sky.
yes. Shall we move on to non-judgment?
Yeah.
I always found that, so the second attitude that we're going to discuss is non-judgment. I found it to be a very interesting word when I was learning this, and not one that I had really heard used commonly in regular life, but basically when you practice non-judgment and you're cultivating your attitude towards the present moment, to have a moment-to-moment experience where you're not getting caught up in your opinions, your likes and your dislikes, and the natural tendency of your mind to judge things and label them as good, bad, or neutral. So our minds just very naturally have this tendency to place our experiences into larger categories. So something that like brings you pleasure, you may label as good, and something that is not pleasurable, label as bad. And then there are experiences that we may not really have much opinion on. And I think those are actually the hardest to pay attention to. And those are the neutral experiences. So with this natural tendency of the mind to do that, it kind of locks you into an automatic type reaction to the things going on in your life that you may not even really know that you're doing. You know, you may be surprised when you start to practice mindfulness that you're having these automatic reactions and these judgments as often as you are. I think that was one of the things that surprised me the most when I really started paying attention to my thoughts. So non-judgment allows you to kind of let go of labels and to experience things more actually as they are, rather than through this lens of distortion that your mind tends to apply to things. I don't know if you have any additions to that, Ni-Cheng, but.
Oh, that's a beautiful description. Our minds have a tendency to label things good and bad right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even I've noticed I do it so often that I don't even realize I'm doing it, you know? So like when I'm actually doing a formal meditation practice, sometimes I'll just practice noting that as thoughts arise, you know, what's judgmental about that? And, you know, in order to suspend judgment, you may find yourself trying to stop judging, and then you can get into this vicious cycle of judging your judgment. You know, and so trying to avoid that, I think the way to really embrace this non-judgment attitude is more of a stepping back as an observer, and having an attitude of just noting rather than being hard on yourself about it actually happening, because it's bound to happen with the way that our minds work. But if you can be an impartial observer to what's going on, you'll have a much easier time of practicing non-judgment. So does anyone have an example from clinical practice or life?
Well, I will share then. In clinic during COVID, there are certain patients that you look at their names on a list, and sometimes there can be a very judgmental reaction to those names because of prior experiences, and whether it be like good or bad. But in noticing when I do that, when I notice that non-judgment, and then also bringing in beginner's mind, like each clinical encounter, despite the fact that I've seen this patient for the last like 10 years, for instance, not preemptively like judging how that clinical encounter is going to go, but simply just letting the clinical encounter play out without attaching the good or the bad label. Like there's no need to judge the clinical encounter, especially as I'm in it. I think that detracts from my ability to fully be present and aware with the patient and with myself as healer in that moment. So yeah, so I definitely catch myself in judgment looking at a clinic list of patients.
Yeah, as you said that, I was like, huh, I do that same thing. Definitely. And in my field, I'm a radiation oncologist. So when we're treating patients, they're usually on a daily treatment for multiple weeks. And there's a weekly visit with each patient. And sometimes you just get to know people's personalities, and some are basic, simple visits, and others are a little more challenging. So I see what you mean there. It's a good example.
And so next is acceptance. So acceptance, this word, I think sometimes gets a bad rap because there is like this implicit but misunderstood meaning of what acceptance is. So acceptance is not resignation, and it's not condoning injustice. Acceptance is really allowing the circumstances, the events of the present moment to be just as they are because they're already here. So it's a very active process as opposed to a passive process that I think passivity gets linked up with acceptance a lot. And it's, yeah, I think that in general, acceptance has gotten a bad rap when in actuality, it's more about acceptance of the moment, acceptance of this moment in time in your life, just as it is, as opposed to trying to resist what's already here, because therein lies a lot of struggle and a lot of unnecessary stress and potentially anxiety. So acceptance is, in other words, letting reality be just as it is. And I guess we're just going to ping pong back and forth, Ellen, about examples and stuff. Do you have an example of acceptance?
I didn't
I can
realize.
go.
Oh, good. She has one.
Oh, yay. Thank you.
Well, I think I think in medicine we're like taught that too, right? Like for example, I'm a pediatrician, and I feel like during residency and fellowship, and every time it was like, oh, she's a first-time mom, like, she's going to complain, or she's like, it's not complain, but like, she's a first-time mom, she doesn't know things well enough, and so it's okay. Like you go in with that kind of like judgment, and you don't I mean, over the years I've learned to accept them better. Like it's not like they don't know because they're first time mom, like they could have taken care of other nieces and other kids. I don't know if I'm giving the right example, but I feel like that has been something that I've learned to kind of like take it in stride, rather than go in with that mindset that, oh, she is a first time mom, so she doesn't know what she's talking about, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that was a great example of actually like the first three attitudes kind of rolled into the example where you're approaching every patient like a new mom for the very first time and noticing the judgment about,
sorry, I have a lot of baggage.
First time moms. No apologies, it's all good. Life is all around us. And then accepting that she is a new first time mom, just as she is, and that's okay.
Yeah, and when I was a GI fellow, I remember like, having a lot of like failure to thrive patients, and some because of socioeconomical neglect or whatever. And the grandmas used to come in, and I used to ask questions. They would like look at me like I'm totally crazy. And now that I have 3 kids, I can relate like why they were looking at me like that. Because because I was clearly a young fellow, had never had kids. Who knew what I knew about kids? And yeah, so now I never go in, I accept them as they are. And I never go in with that judgment that like, because you're a first time mom, you definitely don't know what you're doing kind of thing. So yeah.
That's beautiful, to accept the patient or accept the other person that you're interacting with just as they are. That's a beautiful example of acceptance. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So I did comment in the chat with the 9 attitudes. If anybody wants to check that out, you can look ahead to the future. Very mindful. The next one we're going to discuss is letting go. So I actually wanted to read you guys an excerpt from Full Catastrophe Living, which is the book that Ni-Cheng mentioned earlier, that Jon Kabat-Zinn wrote. So I remember this example when I think of letting go, because I feel like it's such a good description of what we're trying to achieve. So I'm going to read you what he wrote. So he says, they say that in India, there is a particularly clever way of catching monkeys. As the story goes, hunters will cut a hole in a coconut that is just big enough for a monkey to put its hand through. Then they will drill 2 smaller holes in the other end, pass a wire through, and secure the coconut to the base of a tree. Then they slip a banana inside the coconut through the hole, and they hide. The monkey comes down, puts his hand in, and takes hold of the banana. The hole is cleverly crafted so that the open hand can go in, but the fist cannot get out. All the monkey has to do to be free is to let go of the banana, but it seems most monkeys don't let go. So I absolutely love that example because it's more of a concrete illustration of what we're attempting to achieve with mindfulness and letting go. And so our minds have this tendency to, as we talked about, kind of label things. And not only that, but to try to hold on to the things that we label as good. So, our experiences that bring pleasure, or our thoughts that make us feel good. And then it tends to try to reject our bad experiences, the things we don't like, the feelings we don't like to feel, and the thoughts that make us feel more negative. And so when we practice letting go, we kind of, I guess, let go of this tendency to elevate certain parts of our life and to reject others, and actually just allow things to be as they are. And so our minds kind of get caught up in the same way the monkey gets caught. And it's a very simple act that they would have to do to get out of this trap. And that's just to let go of the banana. Our minds are similar in that we may be trapped in a kind of cycle where we're holding on to something. And in our mindfulness practice, we can just practice letting go of that. Any examples? Oh, you're muted.
I love that monkey trap analogy always. It's such a vivid, perfect example of letting go actually serves you so much better and is like the path to liberation, like literally and figuratively. Another poignant example is like from the movie Frozen, when Elsa sings Let It Go. Like she's totally letting go of her like preconceived, strict identity that really wasn't her, letting go of other people's expectations of her and really coming into her own authentic self. So I think that thinking back to Elsa in the movie Frozen is also a really good example of letting go, especially since she sings Let It Go.
Yeah, goes right along. Okay, so at this point, we were going to practice another short meditation practice here in the middle of the 9 attitudes. So if you want to find a comfortable position. And then as you feel ready, just allow your eyes to close. And bring your attention to the breath. Letting go of thoughts as they arise. Noticing the sensations of the breath as the air moves in. Feel it along its entire path. And then notice on the inhales, where in the body are you feeling the air movement the strongest? Could be the nose or the throat. Maybe your chest or abdomen. And just let your attention settle there in that spot for a few breaths. Feeling the sensations of air as it comes in. And then turn your attention to your exhales. Following air fully along the path as the air leaves the body. Noting if the place you're feeling the air movement the strongest is in the same spot or somewhere different than the inhale. And then let your attention rest there for a few breaths. And during this practice, just noting what arises in your mind with a focus on the attitudes we've been talking about, non-judgment, letting go, cultivating your impartial observer attitude. We remind ourselves that we're not our thoughts and that we can separate from those and associate with the observer of the thoughts, the one who's experiencing what's going on in the mind. And just as thoughts arise, being gentle with yourself and kind as you note them and return the attention to the breath. So as you feel ready, you can open your eyes. We're going to move on to the next attitude, which is, are we doing trust next? Yes, okay. So that you're up, Ni-Cheng.
Thank you, Ellen. That was a great practice. I just wanted to have everyone just take a moment and notice how they feel now compared to a few minutes ago before Ellen's practice. And as we talk about trust, trust is about the inherent trust that you have for yourself in being there for yourself and in having a confidence that is authentically from deep within, knowing that anything that you encounter in your life, you can place your trust in yourself to show up fully present just as you are. So one poignant example that I will bring up was my cancer diagnosis. So I was diagnosed with a really aggressive form of breast cancer when I was 31. And there was a lot of mistrust of my body because I felt like having cancer was a big betrayal of my own body trying to like basically kill me. And it wasn't until I learned to trust in the process of what my body was going through cancer treatment, and also trusting in that I was capable of healing from the ravages of chemo and surgeries, and also internally, like on a psycho spiritual emotional level. It wasn't until I started learning to trust in my ability to do that and to have confidence in myself. It wasn't until I had that type of trust that I was able to truly heal, like from the inside out. So hopefully that gives you a little poignant example of trust in yourself.
Thank you for sharing that. We've talked a lot about your experience before in some of our group events, and I'm grateful that you share, because a lot of my patients, go through some of the same things, and I've learned a lot from you, your experience. So we're doing patience next. I think this is another example of something that you really have to focus on developing with yourself when you're practicing mindfulness. Like you mentioned, with trust, that trust in yourself. And we really ask a lot of ourselves when we're learning mindfulness, and patience is definitely an essential part of the process. So, I think of patience as a virtue that grows and develops as we mature, and as we experience more of life. And I know a lot of you are moms or parents, and you see that, growing and developing in your children as they get older. And so, it's a wisdom that we develop as we become more experienced. And it's something that I guess that wisdom that teaches us that some things don't happen in our time. They have to unfold in their own order. And so within mindfulness, we are allowing, again, things to be as they are without rushing. And also, having patience with ourselves in developing the practice, and, experiencing life as we become more experienced through the years. Sometimes, like in my practice, I have days where my mind is much busier than others. So I think that's a good example of when I can invoke the attitude of patience, having patience with myself to know that I just need to have the space to allow it to be busy today. And, that's what today's experience may be. There's other days where an endless stream of judging thoughts may be occurring. And it can be easy to kind of, like I mentioned before, judge your judging. And so again, if you bring patience to your practice, it's a way to allow room for the experience to be, and to let it be what it is.
Thank you, Ellen. I think we can all relate to busy days.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's why I got into mindfulness in the first place, was the endless judging and running a crazy mind. So it's definitely something that takes working at. Even as somebody who teaches others about mindfulness, I still work at it. So
yeah, these attitudes are works in progress in and of itself. And I think the universe planned it out. Actually, me and you planned it out just right, that I ended up getting non-striving. So non-striving is probably my most difficult attitude. Mindfulness. Being a pulmonary physician, entrepreneur, mom, cancer survivor. Non-striving is exactly what it sounds like. It is giving yourself permission to not necessarily be so goal oriented all the time, and to let go of aiming towards the end result, and almost like because you're so focused on achieving the end result, you're missing that journey from your present moment experience to that end result. And non-striving also has to do with when one is learning mindfulness, there's usually a reason for why someone comes to learn how to become more mindful. And there's a state of being that a lot of people try to achieve or strive for, like peace, calm, enlightenment. And paradoxically, it's when you let go of all of those expectations and goals for yourself that's when the true calming of the mind, or the allowing without resistance, it's in that non-striving intentionality that you can actually start experiencing some of the things that you potentially came to learn mindfulness for. But non-striving for sure is probably my most difficult attitude to continue to practice. But accepting myself just as I am and not being judgmental about me not being quote unquote good at non-striving. The attitude of non-striving serves as a really, really poignant reminder for me, and is a way for me to give myself permission that I don't have to keep doing. Like I can simply be right here just as I am in this moment.
I have a good example of when I invoke non-striving into my practice. So, and I don't know, maybe you have experienced this with your cancer treatment, but and I can't remember, there may be a word that people use to describe this phenomenon, but patients that when they go through treatment for cancer, they have, months, sometimes even years, where they're in constant treatment, doctor's appointments, scans, chemo, radiation, surgery. And so they kind of get into this do mode. And then typically, especially for breast cancer, I'm the last oncologist they see, and they'll have several weeks of radiation, and then they're finished. And they're like, what do I do now? And I say, well, you go and you relax and you recover and you like refresh yourself, and you'll see your oncologist in 3 months. And there's just this like, what reaction from a lot of people where they can't even wrap their mind around having a time frame where they're not under constant vigilance with the medical community. Did you have that experience at all?
Yeah, it was like cutting the proverbial umbilical cord in some respects.
Yeah.
So that's a great example of non-striving, that non-striving can actually be quite healing.
Mm-hmm.
We need to non-strive more.
So anyone else have an example they want to share? I think our medical training is another good example of this. You jump through all these hoops. Each step, you go to college, you take the MCAT, you go to med school, you get matched, you do this, that, and the other training, and this, that, and the other board exam. And then when you finish all that, some people feel like, wow, I need to keep it on. And it's kind of confusing to know what to do next when you have no next step per se. So I think that's a good arena in which you can practice non-striving too, when you come to the end of the long road of learning this trade.
But we still do that, right? Like every time I've taken maternity leaves, I have to give like a long explanation at when I'm looking for a new job, like what did I do for 6 weeks, and it clearly states in my resume that that's the maternity leave.
Yes. You're
And
so
with
right.
my last one, or with my second one, I was moving cross country. I moved from the Boston area to California. And I wanted to spend some time with my parents in India. So I took 3 months or 4 months actually. And I had to write like letters when I wanted my California license, when I wanted the job. Like I had to write so many letters, like where was I for 4 months? You know? So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like ingrained in our training that we can never take a break or do anything for ourselves. So that's the hardest one I think we all suffer with.
Yeah, that's a great
This
example.
is the puri, if you guys want to see it, since you asked earlier. How do I flip it? Oh, here. There you
Oh, cool. It looks beautiful.
go. Yeah. Okay.
Is it like a dense bread?
Is it what?
Is it dense or is it kind of like light and airy?
It's fluffy.
Oh. Hmm.
It's rolling the dough and then deep frying it. My kids love it. So
Thank you for sharing that with us.
yeah,
Not just your example, but your curry too.
yeah, thanks. You're
Yeah, we
welcome.
live in such a striving society, especially in healthcare. And so, but we can be the change that we want to see, and we can give ourselves permission to have periods of times in our lives when we choose to non-strive for the sake of our health and wellness. Next up, gratitude.
So gratitude, when you live a moment-to-moment experience, when you're practicing living a mindful life, gratitude is really a natural extension of that. It's kind of a feeling that comes out of appreciating the beauty in each little moment and the small things that you might miss if you weren't paying attention. So I think it's an extension of all of the other attitudes that we just discussed. It's like a natural flowing forth from those attitudes. One way I've noted to kind of cultivate a feeling of gratitude is to notice during the times when you find yourself being kind of the opposite of grateful. So, self-centered or unappreciative or condemning or ungracious. And during those times, just kind of be mindful of the fact that number one, that's the way you're feeling at that time. And secondly, why that may be. And I think when you really evaluate those circumstances, you start to notice that more times arise where you're feeling more gratitude. So that's something that I used to practice when I was first starting a gratitude practice. But in the first, like I think you might have mentioned this, Ni-Cheng, but in the first full catastrophe living, Jon only had 7 attitudes, and gratitude is one that he later kind of upgraded from a list of other attitudes that commonly arise through practicing mindfulness. So anybody have an example of this?
I think there's so much gratitude for the connections that might not have formed due to COVID. Despite COVID, there were a lot of new connections that formed that couldn't have been possible or were non-existent until there was a reason to kind of come together, like the Mindful Healthcare Collective, like me co-teaching with you. So there's a lot of gratitude for connection.
I remember the last time I felt really overwhelmed with gratitude was when I got my first COVID vaccine. So, I mean, I feel like the way that the world has changed since this pandemic began, and especially for us in healthcare, that just felt like the first step towards just making enormous strides. And I was so overwhelmed with thankfulness for the scientists and the physicians and the patients who participated in the trials. That I think is a very relevant example right now. And I also shared with you that my mom, she lives in Seattle, and we live in Wichita, Kansas. So, you know, long distance, and she's in her 60s. And so she took the social distancing measures pretty seriously. And we hadn't seen her since January of 2020. But she was finally able to get her vaccine, and she arrived here yesterday to see us. So that's another example, being reunited with family.
So much gratitude.
Mhm.
And last but not least, generosity. Jon uses this statement in the video where he introduces the 9 attitudes, and it's, can you give yourself to the fullness of life, as a way of demonstrating generosity. And generosity is beyond that of like doing nice things for people. It's being intentional about potentially doing or being with other people for their benefit, not only, but also for your own benefit. So there's this generosity found in giving. But I'd like to add, like, but not at the expense of your own health and wellness. I think that you first have to be generous to your own being, and then you can be generous to others. But sometimes being generous to others ends up kind of replenishing your own cup as well. So generosity. Example of that. I will share that I have many colleagues and collaborators like Jesse, who is going to be coaching for the Mindful Healers part of the Platinum package. And she recommended our course. And so this generosity in lifting others up so that we all rise, it just meant a lot to me. So with that, I wanted to give Ellen.
I'll come on video now. I was taking a Zoom break because I've had too much Zoom today and my eyeballs were hurting. So I told, so I'm not going to look at you all, you know, when it's been too much. I'm being mindful that that happens sometimes. And I have another meeting for the, I run the Physician Wellness Task Force for our local medical society, and it's after this. So I was like, I have to just not focus on the screen. But I wanted to say that I recommended your course because I find that I have coached people who have done the course, and I have seen people who've done mindfulness like in the midst of their coaching. And I just see that, and this is just my intense belief in why I approach coaching from the mindful perspective, is that when we're mindful, it just loops up all those neurons, and we're so much more able to like get into the neuroplasticity and make change. And so I recommend it because it's like an amazing thing that is like, I know I use that word steroids, but it's really better than steroids. It's just like, it's like the breakthrough to get to something else. And so for people who've maybe been working on themselves for a while or working on coaching for a while, and then like, this is the thing that can really like get them to another place, and, or sometimes they need to do this first so that they can actually be open to change and be able to see and notice. And so I recommended it also as a previous participant, and knowing that I consider myself to be somewhat mindful, and I'm a yoga teacher and I'd done mindfulness training, but I hadn't done MBSR. And so I recommended it just wholeheartedly as a human being. And I just wanted to say that.
Practicing one of the attitudes of gratitude. Thank you so much, Jessie.
My pleasure.
I echo those sentiments. Thank you, Jessie. And I think we're going to close with a mindfulness practice that I will lead. So going to get my going again. So as we talked about these 9 attitudes, I'm just reminded that practicing mindfulness really leads us to embrace a feeling of heartfulness. And that is to be full of kindness and gratitude and generosity with others. So keeping that in mind as we head into this practice. So getting into a comfortable position. And then as you feel ready, you can close your eyes, moving the attention to the breath. Feeling now, as we've spent this last hour or so together, how do you feel different from earlier when we first came together? I know I feel a really huge difference in my overall demeanor. I was feeling rather stressed after clinic earlier, and I feel so much more present now that we've spoken about these 9 attitudes. So I'm grateful for that. So notice how you feel, and then move your attention into the breathing. How does the air feel as it enters your body? Notice the temperature of the air. Is it cooler on the way in or the way out? And during this meditation, trying to maintain an attitude of, so our attention isn't a cold and distant observing, but instead it's a warm, heartfelt relationship with whatever is happening in our experience. It's kind of like a loving embrace of what is. So take a moment and let your attention drift down to that place we call the heart center, which is the spot in your chest where you feel the strongest sense of warmth and love and compassion. And just take some time to rest your attention there and notice what's there for you. What is your heart telling you? We'll just take a moment and listen. And then when you feel ready, you can return your attention to your breath. Noticing as any thoughts arise, having a kindness towards them, a gentle noting, and then bringing yourself back into this moment. As you feel ready, you can open your eyes and lift your gaze. And hopefully everybody has a wonderful remainder of your evening. Thank you all for joining us. I think that Ni-Cheng and Jesse and I, we're going to hang around for a little bit if